for patterns, tricks, stitches and tips, wands and needles, embroidery.
In this video, I'm going to be demonstrating turkey work or turkey stitch. This is one of my favorite stitches. It's really going to create a lot of texture in your embroidery. You can leave it longer to create hair or fur or like a fringe effect, or you can cut it really short. It's going to create kind of like a shag rug effect, which is why it's often referred to as turkey rug stitch. It is a stitch that takes a little bit of practice just to get the sequence of the steps, but it's really worth it because it's going to add a lot of extra interest and texture to your embroidery. So for this stitch, we are not going to knot our thread, and we're actually going to start on the front of our hoop. You're going to bring your needle down through your hoop, and then you're going to leave a little bit of length of thread on top of your fabric. How much is going to be dependent on exactly what effect you're trying to create with this stitch. Then you're going to bring your needle back up through the hoop about a needle's width ahead of where you first came down. So it's just a very small space, not even a full stitch length ahead, just a little tiny gap there. And this is going to allow you to create an anchor stitch that's going to hold everything in place. You bring your needle back down through on the opposite side of your thread. And as you pull that thread through, leave a little bit of a loop. Because then we're going to come back up through our fabric in that space that we created. Once you pull your needle through, you can go ahead and pull everything tight, and that's going to anchor that stitch in place. I'm going to move on, advancing about a needle's width ahead, again creating space for that anchor stitch. Leave a loop on the top of your fabric. Advance ahead again, one needle's width approximately. That doesn't have to be perfect, just gives you an idea of the amount of space you're trying to create there. Bring the needle back down on the opposite side of your thread, right next to that first anchor stitch. Leave a loop so we can bring our needle back up through in that space that we created. Go and pull that tight. And now that second stitch is anchored in place. Then we're going to continue with that pattern, bringing the needle down through one needle's width ahead. Bring the needle back up again, leaving that little bit of space there. Needle back down next to that second anchored stitch. And leave a small loop so that we can bring that needle back up through that space. Pull tight, and everything is anchored in place. So you can work this stitch in a straight line like we're doing here. You could do it in a circular or ring shape. You can lay down multiple rows of turkey stitch. It really just depends on again, what effect you're going for, what you're trying to create with this stitch. This stitch does tend to use up a lot of thread, so I highly recommend that you load your needle with a bit more thread than you normally would when you're stitching. It's just going to allow you to do this stitch without having to constantly stop and reload your needle. Do be aware of how much thread you have left on your needle, so that you're not stuck kind of in the middle of a stitch when you run out of thread, because you want to make sure that everything is anchored in place. So I'm probably just going to do one more stitch here before reloading my needle. Tight. And I'll just use my scissors to snip that off. I can reload my needle and just start directly where I left off. Again, leaving that needle's width space to create that anchor stitch. Pull my thread through. Forward a needle's width space ahead to bring my needle back up through my fabric. Go down right next to the previous anchor stitch. And leave that loop so that I can bring the needle back up through that space. Pull that tight, and everything is anchored in place. Do just a couple more here. One more time. Bring that needle down, leaving that little tiny bit of space to anchor your stitch. Bring it back up through, one needle's width ahead. Back down right next to the previous anchor stitch. Leave your loop. Sometimes you have to hold that down so you can see what you're doing and bring that needle back up through the space you've left for it. Pull everything tight and you're anchored in place. So I would continue working the length of my row here, and then I would go ahead and trim my thread. Now again, depending on what you're doing with this stitch, you may leave all these loops in place, or you may go ahead and trim those off. See how that creates a little bit of a fringe effect. You can also cut these really short. You can see how, especially if you have multiple rows of this stitch, how that's going to create kind of that shag rug effect. So it really just depends on what you're trying to do with it. But that is how you do turkey stitch.